I think the State of the Union, as we've come to know it in Washington, is in a somewhat fallen state of grace. Rather than seizing on the opportunity to truly assay the state of the nation, it has really become an opportunity more for a political campaign speech. Spin, self-justification, rationalizations characterize it much more readily than a true assessment of where the nation stands. And thus it is gratifying to see the Atlantic Monthly to try to take a more judicious hand to this task. And they've done this in this issue of the magazine, a double issue, January and February, which I might also say has an absolutely spellbinding and interesting article by Jim Fallows, who was on our faculty at the journalism school and now writes for the Atlantic, Blind into Baghdad, which really chronicles in a very narrative form all of the work, the research, the studies that were done prior to the war that would have pointed the way for an easier occupation and perhaps a more felicitous end to this adventure, but alas, were all ignored. Within the magazine, there are a whole series of shorter articles which talk about health, governance, politics, the gender gap, and other issues which do kind of take the temperature of the country. And it is indeed a welcome effort. I'm really happy that we can do this kind of effort, which is a collaboration with the Atlantic Monthly and the New American Foundation, because I think it's precisely the sort of thing that universities ought to do more of, to air issues that are happening in the real world, to bring people in from the outside and mix them with people from our own faculty. And tonight we have Brad DeLong from the economics faculty. Join me in welcoming now John Fox Sullivan, who's the president of Atlantic Media, who will introduce tonight's panelists and program.
Thank you, Chancellor, and thank you, Dean Schell. It is a real honor and pleasure on behalf of Atlantic to be here at Berkeley and before this terrific group. And if I may speak personally, as a kid, I've lived in the East for most of my life, but as a child I lived in Carmel for 3 years. And at no point when I was in 7th grade at Carmel, California, did I think I'd be standing in this position in Berkeley, so it's kind of fun to be here. It really is an honor to be here. Our goal really with this evening and similar events that we're doing is to do what we call Atlantic Live, to take the magazine, which in this case has done a series of pieces on the State of the Union, as Dean Schell has talked about, and take them live before audiences such as this, where the actual people who have written the material and with a ringer in the form of Brad DeLong here, and get this information, have a conversation with you. There's going to be a good chance for questions and answers, and I think it should be a fun evening. This whole series, the State of the Union package, this is the second time we've done it, second year. We do it in conjunction with the New America Foundation, which is located in Washington, which is one of the premier and hottest think tanks in town. Ted Halstead is the president of that, and Ted is on our panel tonight. We want to thank, before we get on here, our partner, one of our partners in this event, along with New American Foundation, is also Microsoft Corporation. Microsoft has helped us do this here, as well as recently in Georgetown in Washington, and as well as some other events around the country. So we appreciate their support and help. Let me just introduce the panel. I am not going to give you bios. You have material. These are distinguished folks, and I think we'd rather save time for you to ask questions than for long-winded intros. But having said that, immediately to my right, Jim Fallows, national correspondent for The Atlantic, a former professor here. Jim has been all over the place in the world of journalism and one of the giants in the field. Brad DeLong, your own professor, one of the highly or most esteemed economists of his generation. Ted Halstead, as I said, president of New America Foundation, and Shannon Brownlee, a contributor to New America Foundation. What we're going to do tonight is each of these folks will do an 8-minute riff, maybe more substantive than a riff, but we'll try and get through it pretty quickly. And then what we're going to have is Michael Kinsley is going to join us and moderate the panel and lead the discussion. Michael Kinsley, I will go on about for just a second. Michael is the co-editor, or the original editor of Slate Magazine. He's been editor of New Republic. He was on CNN. And now a personal comment. He is one of the most esteemed and finest journalists of my or his generation. And I must say, I cannot say enough about this man. He is so respected by his peers, and it's a treat to have him here. And that's not to diminish the presence of any of the other of our guests. So that's the program. We hope to have a little insight and analysis. Atlantic's role in this whole thing, I want to sum up in a quote from David Broder, who actually referred to this program and a book version of it from last year that's coming out called The Real State of the Union. Broder described this whole activity that we're engaged in as an exhilarating and mind-stretching way of thinking about where the United States stands at this moment. That's exactly what the Atlantic Monthly tries to do in a more general sense, and that is to provide an exhilarating and mind-stretching way of thinking about a whole range of subjects. So tonight, it's the State of the Union, and now I'm going to turn it over to Jim, and we'll get on with the program. At the end of their session, there will be absolutely time for questions. Come on up to the mics, identify yourselves, and let's enjoy it all. Jim?
Thank you very much, John Sullivan. Thanks, Dean Orville Schell. Thanks, Chancellor Berdahl, and thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure for me to be here with many friends from my time in Berkeley and an event which is the conjunction of three institutions I've been part of and care about a lot. One is the Atlantic Monthly, which I started working for more than 25 years ago. And second, the New America Foundation, which I should disclose I'm the chairman of the board of, and UC Berkeley, which my brother graduated from many years ago, and which more recently I had the honor to teach here. So thank you for having us. We're under a strict 8-minute time clock, each one of us who's making the initial presentations. I've already used about 30 seconds, so let me say very briefly my role in the presentation here. What I'm about to say is slightly different in its subject matter, in its origin, and its approach from what you'll be hearing from the other speakers. Subject matter, I'm going to speak about foreign policy and its role in the overall State of the Union. That's different because the two installments of the real State of the Union issue that we've put out have concentrated on domestic policy. And our view here has been that in the long run, of course, the robustness of any nation's policy depends on the strength of its economy, the soundness of its domestic system. So we have concentrated on domestic issues, and that's much of what you'll hear, but clearly in the decisions we have to make as a nation this fall and in the long run course of our nation, foreign policy also matters, so I'll be talking about that. Second, in its origins, my article in this package and my presence here is not due to part of the State of the Union package, but a separate article I did about the planning for the post-war situation in Iraq, and I'll mention that briefly. Finally, the differentness in approach. You'll hear from some of my colleagues some prescriptions, I think, about ways that we could deal more constructively. What I'm going to do is more raise several questions, ones that I do not have answers to, but I think are the questions that whatever administration next governs the country will need to deal with. My background assumption is that to a degree, dealing in the world is always a matter of trying to set the balance in a number of more or less eternal questions. That is, the questions of how we use the resources at our disposal to protect ourselves against threats and to advance the causes we believe to be desirable around the world. So I'd like to tick off what I think are some of the interesting ways those questions now have current reality for this year, for electoral purposes, and for governing in the years ahead. These are the real State of the Union questions when it comes to our dealing with the rest of the world. I should say, as one other prefatory comment, that foreign policy, even more than domestic policy, can be thought of as a continuing learning experience. We have successes, we have failures, we try to learn from them. We've had one dramatic success and two dramatic failures from which to learn in our recent international experience. The dramatic success was, of course, the execution of the actual combat policy in Iraq, which worked far better than most people predicted and which military leaders will analyze for years. The two failures are the subjects of two articles in this issue. One, the pre-war intelligence, how we could have been so certain about things that seemed to be so wrong, and the other was the post-war planning, how so much preparation could have been so misused. So I think there is stuff for us to learn from, stuff for scholars to study in institutions like this, stuff for political leaders to deal with. But we as a public, I think, might ask questions like some of the following one. I propose these as ones which might be in the background during our electoral campaign. And they sort of move up the scale from specificity to more generality and then to something which almost makes your head hurt to think about. The most specific question is, first, has American foreign policy actually changed? By this I mean, about nearly 2 years ago, in the summer of 2002, the Bush administration announced its new policy, often known as preemptive or preventive war. The idea was, in an era when we had shown ourselves to be vulnerable to international terrorism as we never were before, could we wait to respond to threats? I think it is an important foreign policy question about whether this was, for the Bush administration's purposes, a one-war policy, that is, a rationalization for Iraq, or does this, in fact, reflect the way we have to deal with a new kind of threat coming from new sources? Query, has the threat changed in such a way that our policy needs to be not deterrence, not second strike, but being proactive, preemptive, preventive in the ways that we have seen the United States actually perform in the last year? A second and larger question, I suspect that first question is actually answerable, because I think the answer is no, policy has not changed. We had a one-war doctrine. But a second and larger question is, have our ambitions in the world actually changed? Over the long sweep of American history, there's been an ebb and flow of our ambitions. Sometimes we just wish other countries to leave us alone. Sometimes we wish them to be different from the way they are. We wish them to be better. We wish them to be more subservient to our will. We wish their economies to grow. And there has been, in the last year in American foreign policy, a kind of assertive Wilsonianism, the idea that we can remake a part of the world which is, by this policy, in need of remaking by bringing democracy, bringing market progress to the Arab Islamic world, which, by this logic, will fester without it. Is this a sustainable, long-term difference in American policy? Are we ready for this kind of Wilsonianism? There is a corollary to it, which I'll just mention and put on the table for perhaps future discussion. Have our economic ambitions for the rest of the world changed? Do we need for ourselves to prosper to bring the whole world up to a kind of market democracy, or how does economics affect our dealings with the rest of the world? The next and even harder question that I think the next president, whoever he will be, will need to deal with is how to maximize or how to optimize the range of powers, the range of tools that the United States has to use in the world. At this moment in our history, it seems to me, our power in the world is very largely hard power, military power. The fact that we can send in the 82nd Airborne, the fact that we can send in the 3rd or 1st Divisions, or send in the U.S. Navy. Over the post-World War II sweep of our involvement in the world, we've had a various range of hard power and all the different tools that Joseph Nye has called soft power, from our example as a functioning society, the power of our market, the power of our aid, the power of our alliances, the power of international institutions. What in the next stage of our history is the right kind of mixture of these hard and soft power, and how can we make that mix serve our interest and the world's interests as we define them in the most attractive way? And how will we pay for whatever other kinds of power we want to exercise? The next question, for whatever the mixture of powers may prove to be, is how we can sustain them in some kind of permanent, plausible way. What I have in mind here is that in the era when America's power is so distinctly hard, in the way that it's been applied in the rest of the world. We are neither paying the fiscal cost for it in terms of taxes, nor are we paying in a strange way the social cost. The proportion of Americans in uniform is the lowest it's been since before the Spanish-American War. For those people in uniform, this has been a 2-year permanent emergency. For the rest of it, it has not. If we're to exert this kind of power worldwide, how will we pay for it, and how will we muster the kind of civic basis for it that I think is not sustainable on current basis? The final question, which is the one that makes my head hurt, is how do we feel at the beginning of this century, at a time of the global economy, of having our role in the world be as heavily dependent on the personalities and the personal strengths and weaknesses of a handful of people, as I assert it is today. One of the themes I try to advance in this article in The Atlantic is that the personal strengths, weaknesses, foibles, blind spots, and experiences of 5 or 6 people at the top of our government say a very large amount about the way the United States has carried out its power, the successes and the failures it's had. How can we, as a democracy of nearly 300 million people, how can we limit the influence that the vagaries of a few number of people can have on us? I turn it over now, I think, to Brad DeLong, your own Brad DeLong.
Thank you. Okay, let me talk, not surprisingly, like an economist. In the mid-1990s, labor productivity growth in America accelerated. It accelerated from an average of 1.2% per year to an average of 3% per year. Now, at a rate of labor productivity growth of 1.2% per year, America is a land of diminished expectations. It takes roughly 60 years for incomes to double. Lots of good things that we would want to accomplish, they seem outside our private and public budgets. At a rate of labor productivity growth of 3% per year, America's a land of infinite promise. Incomes double every 25 years, and our public and private resources seem ample, are ample. Now, we economists are carrying on an ongoing debate about whether 1/6, that's Greg Mankiw's estimate, or 1/3 or 1/2, that's my estimate, of the acceleration in productivity growth since 1995 is due to better policies by the coalition that marched under Bill Clinton's banner, and how much of the acceleration is due to good technological luck, right? The skill and ingenuity of our engineers, especially in the high-tech industries. We economists debate how long the boom in productivity growth is going to last. 5 more years, a decade, a generation, longer? That's what we economists talk about, but now let me turn around and say I really don't want to go there. What I want to say instead is that however long it lasts, today America's productive potential is growing very rapidly. I want to say that today America should seem an arena of enormous opportunity, and I want to say that to a substantial and really remarkable degree, this opportunity is being wasted, and being wasted by bad choices by our government, being wasted by the Bush administration. First, let me talk about employment. Rapid productivity growth is a very good thing. It means incomes and standards of living are growing very rapidly in potential. But it also means that rapid growth of demand, rapid growth of spending is needed to keep us close to full employment. We're not close to full employment. We're not close to full employment because demand growth over the past 4 years has been not rapid, but only moderate. Now, the Federal Reserve has done close to all it can to boost demand growth, but the Bush administration and the Republican congressional leadership have not. They have pursued huge tax cuts for the 300,000 plus a year crowd and said that they're doing this because it's a jobs program. It's a way to boost employment. Now, a tax cut that really is a jobs program, such a tax cut gets the money not to the 300,000 plus a year crowd who save it, but gets the money to not rich people who will go out and quickly spend it, and so boost demand. Paul O'Neill and Ron Suskind have given us a view into Bush administration decision-making, and the thinking, to the extent there was thinking, was we want to reward our political base. Employment will probably recover and grow strongly anyway, so why not ram an upper-class tax cut through the Congress by claiming it's our jobs program? That's a gamble George W. Bush and company took, Those Americans who are unemployed, who fear becoming unemployed, or who see their wages and salaries stagnate because of the slack labor market. That's a gamble that those Americans lost. Second, income distribution. The past 30 years have seen an extraordinary widening of America's income distribution, unaccompanied by any increase in income mobility. This means that we are markedly less of a middle-class society than we were a generation ago. And as today's 300,000 plus a year crowd strives to assure comfortable lives for their children, we will lose any claim to even aspire to anything like equality of opportunity. Policies to boost equality of opportunity, to increase mobility, to return us to a more middle-class society, like the ones that those of our predecessors who were lucky enough to be both white and male lived in the first post-World War II generation. Such policies are desperately needed, but George W. Bush and his Congress are paddling as fast as they dare in the opposite direction. Third, the future of our social insurance programs. We don't want to live in a country in which the young poor or the old poor die on the street of diseases we know how to treat because our medical system can't get up the energy or can't get the organization to fund their treatment. We don't want to see large chunks of our population over 70 living on cat food. We need to bring the federal budget into not balance but surplus, not this year or next year when we'll still need a deficit to boost demand, but very soon thereafter. We need to do this because we will need a surplus and budget in surplus over the next 20 years to assemble the fiscal resources and the political will to deal with the retirement of the baby boom generation and to deal with the continued explosion of medical technology and the continued rapid escalation of medical costs. And all this, now I won't say that its economic policies are the Bush administration at its most feckless, because going blind into Baghdad seems to be more feckless. Pursuing a bizarre attitude that replaces science with ideology in a fit of 20th century Lysenkoism around a lot of issues having to do with technological progress seems more feckless. But the Bush approach to the long-run budget to economic policy, it definitely has less feck than I thought I would ever see in an American government. Now, let me be clear. As a country, America is immensely strong. As a civilization, America is immensely productive. As a people, America is immensely inventive. What threatens us via Bush economic mismanagement, it's not anything that can be called disaster. It's only something that can be called a waste of opportunity. Nevertheless, I find this waste of opportunity to be heartbreaking. And let me stop there before the mean people in the front row threaten me with the red sign.
Thank you. I would actually, after thanking you all for coming, I would like to begin with an experiment, if you're so kind as to indulge me. I'm going to ask you to self-identify as either a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent by a show of hands, and I ask you to just keep them up for a moment. So, if you consider yourself a Republican, please raise your hand. I'm glad to see that there are one or two in the room. If you consider yourself a Democrat, please raise your hand. I can't see any hands. If you consider yourself an independent, please raise your hand. Okay, clearly we have more Democrats, second independent, third Republicans. I should tell you the last State of the Union event that we did like this at Georgetown, it was quite the inverse. We had a lot of Republican hands. When you ask that question to the entire country, though, and this is my starting point, a startling fact jumps out, which is that a clear plurality of American citizens self-identify as independent, which is really quite remarkable. In a two-party system, more people say neither the above than pick one of the existing options. So the question is why? Well, I would argue that the answer is because a large portion of the American people know that neither party is offering a coherent, honest, or forward-looking agenda, nor one that rises to the challenges or opportunities of the 21st century. In fact, you could say that although our country has entered the so-called information age, we remain trapped in industrial era institutions, ideologies, and political parties. The way forward is a new political agenda that actually speaks to these new dynamics of the information age. Incidentally, I gave this talk yesterday in 35 minutes, and I have 8 today, so I'm going to go rather quickly through some of these points. What is the defining feature of the information age? Well, I would argue a more sophisticated citizenry, one capable of handling far more responsibility and far more choices. Therefore, I think one of the defining features of an information age politics ought to be more choices of all types. Here's where it gets interesting, though, because on the surface, it often seems that there is a tension between choice and flexibility on the one hand, the defining features of the information age, and fairness and security on the other hand, which are perennial American values. And our two parties do a great deal to exacerbate this sense of a trade-off between the two. So, for example, Republicans tell us they want to privatize Social Security because it would give retirees or young people more choices. They say they want school choice, obviously because it would put more power in the hands of parents. Democrats, by contrast, say no, we don't want that because it would undermine fairness, it would undermine security. The way that the debate, and fair enough, so many of the Republican proposals would do just that. But the point is that the way our politics is framed, it's as if these two are mutually exclusive, as if the American people have to choose between flexibility and fairness. I believe that whichever party is first to square this circle and offer the American people what they most want, which is flexibility and fairness at the same time, that party will own the future of American politics for the next several decades. In many ways, this offers a philosophic underpinning to many of the proposals that you would see in the Atlantic Monthly State of the Union package over the last 2 years. What we've done is we haven't looked at all our national problems from a perspective of partisanship, but rather from a perspective of pragmatism and what works. So in very rapid fire mode, since I think I just saw my 4-minute mark, thank you, I'm going to try in 4 minutes to give you 5 big ideas which would solve 5 of our most urgent national problems in a way that balances and enhances flexibility and fairness. Let's start with education. Neither party is willing to address the biggest problem, I believe, facing our K-12 education system, and that is the antiquated localized funding mechanism by which we support our schools. As a result of it, the average kid in Mississippi gets $4,000 on average spent on his or her education. The average child in New Jersey gets $12,000, even after adjusting for cost of living differentials. The way forward, we believe, and this was one of the articles in last year's State of the Union package, is to combine equalization of school funding nationwide with some version of school choice, providing, again, flexibility and fairness at the same time. Next issue, let's move to healthcare, another problem that seems intractable with 43 million uninsured Americans. Again, we don't think that the parties are asking the real question. The real question is, first, why do we have an employer-based system when so many citizens change jobs so often? It's an accident of history. Here in California, you change jobs on average every 3 years. We believe that health insurance in the future should be citizen-based, follow you from job to job, rather than employer-based. And how could you get there? How could you cover everybody without a single payer system, which won't fly politically in this country? Well, through a system of mandatory insurance, treating health insurance much like car insurance and making an individual mandate. Doing that would A, cover everybody, B, lower the cost for all of those who now have insurance, and C, increase the quality. And we can get into that more in the Q&A if you're interested. A third big problem, Social Security, what to do about it? Well, we could go on for about 3 hours on that one, but one of the pieces we've had in the Atlantic has put forward a very novel idea, again, a combination of flexibility and fairness, which is a progressive version of private Social Security accounts. And I'm telling you all of these things to tease you, really, to go and read the last 2 issues or the book that compiles them that is coming out next week. Let me go to a fourth problem, which is how do we fix our electoral system, which has so few choices? You'll notice Ralph Nader's running again. Everybody, I'm sure, is thrilled. How do you solve the problem of a vote for an independent candidate being not only a wasted vote, but a vote for the person you least want. Well, your neighboring city of San Francisco passed recently instant runoff voting, where come election day, you vote not just once, but you don't vote twice, but you can vote in your one vote. You can say, here's my first choice, my second choice, and my third choice. If we had such a thing, we would have far more credible choices, far broader choices, and no spoilers anymore. In fact, in such a system, in the '92 election, George Bush Sr. probably would have won because Perot stole the election from him, but in the last election, George Bush Jr. would probably have lost because Nader, in effect, stole the election from Gore. I think I have 1 minute left, which leaves me one idea. How in 1 minute do we solve the problem or make a big dent in the problem of growing inequality and lack of equal opportunity in this country? The idea that we've written about in the State of the Union package is that of endowing every American child from birth with financial assets so that every child becomes a trust fund baby. Unless you think this is an outrageous idea, Tony Blair in Britain just enacted exactly this. Over there it is called the Baby Bond Plan. And President Bush himself here has been talking about the ownership society. Doing this could radically transform economic opportunity, and it would be a 21st century equivalent of what we've done before. In the 19th century, we had the Homestead Act to broaden the ownership of of land in this country. In the 20th century, it was the home mortgage interest deduction to broaden the ownership of homes. And in the 21st century, it should be some form of universal capitalism. Those are 5 big ideas that combine flexibility and fairness, and that would bring us towards a new politics, and that I hope inspire you to take a look at the back issue, this issue, and the book. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all for being here. It's especially nice to be here at UC Berkeley because I went to college and graduate school just down the way at another UC campus, Santa Cruz. Maybe you've heard of it. Oh, wow, you. The smallest UC campus with a SWAT team assigned to it. And in the spirit of being a troublemaker, I'd like to talk about healthcare in America. I think everybody here probably is aware of 2 out of the 3 major flaws in the U.S. healthcare system. One of those, obviously, is that we can't seem to find a way to insure more than 40 million citizens. The other one is that we are spending an ungodly amount of money on healthcare, $1.6 trillion at last count, about 15% of GDP. We spend about $5,400 for every man, woman, and child, which is 2 to 4 times what any other developed nation spends per capita. But there's one more fly in the ointment, and the third flaw in our healthcare system, and that's quality, which is bad. It is, by every measure, very poor, especially considering how much we spend. Now, I'm going to draw a connection for you between poor quality and high cost in a little bit. But first, let me just count the ways for a moment that the quality is bad. About 18,000 Americans die prematurely each year because they don't get the treatment that they need. Most of those people are among the 40 million who are uninsured. But 4.5 times that many die from medical errors each year. About 90,000 Americans die because somebody made a mistake. A nurse gave you the wrong medicine. A doctor took out the wrong kidney. A doctor didn't notice on the chart that somebody had a rare bone disease, and when they intubated them, they broke the patient's neck. I saw that on ER a few weeks ago. You know, these are human errors, and but they happen because the system is overburdened. Here's some more statistics. About 50,000 Americans die each year from an infection they got in the hospital. Now, statistics don't really tell you the full story, and anybody who's been inside the healthcare system has a pretty good sense. I mean, you wait for 45 minutes in your doctor's office, so you get 4 minutes and 35 seconds with your internist. Or my father's experience, he nearly died from taking a statin drug, one of the cholesterol-lowering drugs, and it began to break down all the muscles in his body, which turns out to be a much more common side effect than most of us would want to believe. So by every objective and subjective measure, the quality of health care in this country is remarkably poor. Now, how can this be? We have more money than anybody, we have more doctors, we have more technology, we have more drugs. The one thing we don't have is information. Now, I'm not talking about just any kind of information. I'm not talking about the kind of information that you're awash in when you read the paper about this new disease to worry about. My favorite new one is gastroesophageal reflux disease, which used to be called heartburn. I'm talking about the kind of information that would help consumers of medicine, you and me, distinguish between high-quality care and low-quality care. Now, in any marketplace that's functioning properly, that provides a good or a service, the marketplace imposes its own kind of discipline, its own demands for high quality. So if you make a television that breaks within 2 weeks of purchase, you either have to lower your price a lot, or you have to learn how to make televisions that last. Consumers vote with their wallets, and the marketplace rewards high quality and punishes low quality. That's not so in the healthcare system. Healthcare is an industry where we pay bad producers as much as we pay good ones. We pay bad hospitals where lots of errors are made, where lots of patients get infections, as much as we pay the good ones. And we pay bad doctors as much as we pay good ones. Now, why would that be? Why doesn't the marketplace distinguish between good and bad caregivers? The reason is this: we pay doctors and hospitals for how much they do, not for how well they care for us. The more CT scans a hospital performs, the more payments it will receive. So if it buys a new fancy CT scanner, it needs to recoup that investment, and it gives more CT scans. The more office visits your doctor schedules, the more she will be reimbursed by insurers. That's one of the main reasons that all the market-based efforts to reform healthcare haven't worked very well. The suppliers of the service are determining how much of the service you need, and you, the consumer, don't have the information that you need to tell the difference between high and low quality care. So what can we do about that? Well, we can gather more information, but not just any old kind of information, and certainly not the kind of information that we see in the news all the time, which is really about selling more medicine, and not even the kind of information that appears in so-called consumer reports about America's best hospitals, which are really reputation surveys. They don't really tell you, the consumer of healthcare, the things that you really need to know. We need information about who is delivering good care, who's delivering bad care, who's delivering mediocre care, and what care is really effective. So one of the ways to get that is something called outcomes data. You need to know when patient A goes to this, when a patient with a particular diagnosis goes to hospital A, do they come out better, or do they come out better when they go to hospital B? But we also need another kind of information, which, believe it or not, in this age of scientific medicine, is we don't know much about the effectiveness of the care that we receive. So doctors don't really know whether or not mammograms for women in their 40s really save lives. They don't know, many doctors don't know that Celebrex, which is this new expensive pain medication, they don't know that it doesn't work any better than good old ibuprofen, and it doesn't have a lower rate of stomach problems, which is the way it's been sold. They also don't know that statins don't prevent heart disease. Statins are good if you've already had a heart attack, but they don't necessarily prevent a first heart attack. So one way to get that kind of information, one of the only ways I think we can get this kind of information, is a federal agency that's devoted to gathering outcomes information and is also devoted to getting the kinds of effectiveness information that we need. And you might imagine that this agency needs a fair amount of insulation from the healthcare industry, or it's going to be shot down fairly quickly. This has happened in the past. So it kind of needs to be a Federal Reserve Board of healthcare outcomes. Now, earlier I told you there's a connection, and I'm going to finish up fairly soon, but I told you there was a connection between cost and quality. Now, here's why. About 30%, as much as 30% of the money that we spend on health care goes towards office visits, drugs, surgeries, hospitalizations, and tests that do nothing to improve our health, and everything to drive up costs. Healthcare economists call this overtreatment, and it's an enormous unrecognized problem in medicine outside of healthcare policymaker circles and healthcare economist circles. So it cost us a bundle, about $400 billion last year, and it puts us at risk for suffering medical errors, getting hospital infections, getting a bad reaction from the drug. It's all it increases the chances that you're going to suffer the downsides of being within the medical system. And in other words, it contributes to poor quality. So I think that the thing that we really have to do in this country is recognize, A, the quality of health care is poor, and B, recognize that we need a very particular kind of information to improve it. Now, you can probably imagine that that's not a terribly popular idea in Washington right now, a new federal agency. And it's probably not going to be very popular with doctors and hospitals, at least not at first. But there are two groups of citizens that should embrace it. There are American businesses who are seeing their costs for health care rising at astronomical rates, and American patients. And I think they will like this idea once they figure out that they've all been paying for substandard health care. Thank you.
Thanks, Shannon. I think, well, this is the question and answer portion. I was not told I was limited to 8 minutes, and I will try to be brief in asking a couple of questions of each of the panelists as an inspiration to you when it's your turn to be brief too. That is one of two caveats. The other is, this is like Jeopardy. Make your question in the form of a question. And I'm going to go in. I'm going to go in reverse order, just for reasons of fairness and flexibility. And I'll start with Shannon. If outcomes research data shows that a treatment is completely worthless or actually harmful, that's great, and it's very easy to say it would be great to have that data so we can stop doing that. But isn't it more likely to show in many cases that the expensive treatment is only slightly more effective than the cheap one? And are we really going to be able to make any practical use of that? Or are we just going to say, I want that more expensive one?
I think there are two answers to your question. One is that I think the more common thing that's going to come out is that we're going to find out that treatments are good for some people and not for a lot of others. And so we'll have to start making distinctions between patients. Instead of giving everybody whatever it is, you'll start to narrow it down to the people who can really benefit. The second piece of the answer is that the way to encourage all of healthcare to start giving treatments that are more effective is for Medicare to start doing it. And if it's really only marginally better, if the more expensive treatment is only marginally better, I think it's reasonable for Medicare to say, well, you got to pay a little bit of extra, or to say we won't pay for the more expensive treatment.
So you're saying that people, statistically, if you take that tiny margin over the entire population, there are going to be people who are going to die prematurely or die earlier than they otherwise would because they're not taking a medicine that would only have a tiny chance of improving their condition.
Yes, but there's always a downside to it as well, because almost every treatment has a risk attached to it. And so if the improvement of odds is tiny, there's going to be the counterbalancing potential for you to die from the treatment as well.
All right. Do I remember correctly that there were outcomes data was built into the Clinton health care plan, and that the Republicans attacked that rather effectively, saying that this would cause the government to invade your privacy and it's none of their business, and this was a bad thing. Do I remember that correctly? And what are the merits of that question?
Actually, I think that your previous question, what you're really getting at is, are we going to ration?
Yeah.
So we'll leave that for the moment. We
well,
already ration.
Right.
We ration irrationally right now.
Right. So, well, since you brought it up, is the solution to the cure for rationing irrationally to ration rationally or not to ration at all?
Well, you could say we don't ration at all, but at least know what it is you're rationing and whether or not it works.
All right.
But the question about the Clinton health care plan, yes, there was a plan for outcomes data, and in fact, we did have an agency that was starting to do outcomes data and efficacy data. And it was shot down by a very determined group of back surgeons in large measure because they didn't like the outcome of the outcomes. And it showed that one of the things they were doing wasn't working. So that's why I think it really needs enormous political insulation, and I don't know how you get to that.
Well,
that's for you political guys to figure out.
Well, leave it to us. Ted, you say that neither party offers an honest, forward-looking agenda, and that is why polls show that most people don't like what the parties stand for and claim to be independent. Now, I wonder what an economist would say about that. If there is an honest, forward-looking agenda, the economists have the story about the $10 bill that's lying there in Sproul Plaza, and the economist says this can't be there because if it was there, someone would pick it up. If there is an honest, forward-looking agenda sitting there that would bring enormous popularity to the party that chose to grab it, why are they offering what you regard as dishonest, backward-looking agendas? Are they idiots?
Oh, you're setting that one up for me now, aren't you? Because the parties, in their own ways, I think, are trapped by their own special interest groups. If you ask the American people, do you consider yourself conservative, liberal, or moderate, the vast majority say that they are moderate. Yet you see at least the party in power now, the Republican Party, moving ever further to the right. In the actual piece that I wrote for this issue of the State of the Union package, my topic was an intellectual audit of the two parties. And the title was The Chieftains and the Church. I accused the Republicans of operating like a theocracy, having a very clear, strong ideology that they pursue with near religious fervor, but a fundamentally misguided one. By contrast, I described the Democrats as the party of the chieftains because they're constantly fighting amongst themselves and have very little clarity of message whatsoever. I believe that the proposals that I mentioned would be good for the country. Would they be popular politically? Would it be popular to say, hey, we should cut, means test entitlements, or we should have school choice? Well, no, the teacher unions would go crazy in the Democratic Party. So each of the parties is, to a considerable degree, locked in by its own special interests, which have veto power over the selection of a candidate in the first place.
So there is an honest, forward-looking agenda that would be wildly popular. With the vast majority or the plurality of people who don't associate themselves with. I mean, Ted, you start with the premise that most people, or at least more people than associate with the parties, consider themselves to be independents, and then you say that the parties are pandering to special interests which control our politics.
Yes. Let me give you an example in both cases. I mean,
well, don't give me an example. Explain why someone hasn't picked up the $10 bill if it's lying there.
For the precise reason that our electoral rules lock us into a two-party system. In the last election, the most popular candidate at the beginning was Senator John McCain. He could never get the Republican nomination because the religious right had effective veto power when it came to nominating the Republican candidate. And you know what? He actually, he was attacking them, and they ensured that. On the other hand, take a look at Lieberman, who was the vice presidential candidate. I happen to like what pre-metamorphosis Lieberman stood for. He was interested in school choice. He was questioning affirmative action. He was interested in some form of privatizing Social Security. Upon being appointed as the vice presidential candidate, he reversed himself on all three fronts and started towing the party line. So yes, I think that the parties, due to their own bases, are constrained from pushing a more majoritarian agenda.
Let me ask you what you think of an alternative theory of why people say they're independent and they reject the parties, that there is an irrational and not terribly attractive snobbery about politics among Americans of every class, and they what they don't like about, no one likes to admit that they like politicians, and they don't like special interests except for the ones they're in, and what they really don't like about politics is that it can't deliver their cake and eat it too.
I would love to have an empirical test of this proposition by having a leading presidential candidate who actually stood for some of these proposals so that we could see whether the independent voters came out or not. But I would point out that even with our two parties now, neither party dares to talk about the entitlement crisis that is 10 years away. Neither party has a leading candidate now that is saying we need universal health insurance. Neither party is willing to say, hey, we need to throw out the way we fund schools or even our school calendars. Both of them are, the Democratic Party is playing it very safe, and the Republican Party, for reasons that Brad mentioned in part, is catering to its own agenda. So yes, I would love to have a candidate out there who is willing to say we need shared sacrifice and willing to put forward bold ideas, but I don't see that person.
You would love it. I would love it. Do you think that is what these people who identify themselves as independents are longing for, is a candidate who's going to tell them they have to pay more taxes? And
yes.
Yeah, well, in Berkeley, perhaps. I hope you're
Michael,
right.
Let me ask you one question. Why was John McCain, who had a sort of a message of, just, he had this what was it, the what express was it? The Straight Talk Express, right. I mean, he was like this honest guy willing to appeal to shared sacrifice on a variety of fronts. He was wildly popular.
What happened to him was what you say happened to Lieberman, which is he was wildly popular when his message was abstract. We must go beyond simple yes and no, right and left, Republican, Democrat, and look for solutions. But then when he starts to talk about solutions that you recommend, all of which are great, or most of which I think I would support, and most of the people in this room, people started to lose interest, and he would have had to move the same way Lieberman was moving. That would be my thesis. All right, Brad, if 1.3% growth in I can't remember what was the
Was in labor productivity?
yeah, growth in labor productivity means we're going down the rat hole, and 3% means sunny progress forever. Isn't one lesson of that the reliance we place on these statistics is in excess of their ability to actually predict anything?
Well, certainly the margin for error is large.
Well, what is the
There is, a very powerful sense in which between 1973 and 1995, right, during the period when American wages and salaries went from a steady upward course that you could see, right, that you could see that you were living materially better than your 10-year older siblings were at your age, and much better than the stories your parents told about having to walk 4 miles barefoot through the snow uphill both ways to school and back. That between 1973 and 95, when the sense of forward material progress and upward motion ceased as a result of oil shocks, productivity slowdowns, drag put on the economy by the Reagan deficits, et cetera, American politics turned really mean. Right? Whether it's school funding in California and our current bizarre system of grandfathering in long-term homeowners so they pay orders of magnitude less property tax than anybody else, whether it's cutbacks on commitments to universal education or cutbacks on, say, everything down to the famous school lunch programs with ketchup being a vegetable. American politics was much meaner between 73 and 95 than it was back in the first post-World War II generation. And certainly, at least the hope was after 1995, that as economic growth accelerated, Americans would have much more of a sense of how strong they were, of how great and powerful their resources were, and how fast those resources were growing. And that's at least where I see the opportunity is. To realize that with technological progress and labor productivity growth at levels that we have the potential to reach, that we really do have ample private and public resources to accomplish great things. And that, I think, is the opportunity the Bush administration is wasting, or at least doing its best to divert to the 300,000 plus a year crowd.
We're out of time. Thanks very much to the panel. Thanks to everybody here for coming.